I am reflecting on the way that when we imagine spiritual leaders in action, even when we're talking about spiritual support through the lens of accompaniment, there's still a sort of maybe an imagery associated with that activity that is one person coming alongside another person, that it is a one-to-one relationship, or it's about the individual orienting to another individual, or the individuals orienting to a group, which is different from, say, meta compassion practice of imagining that my practice is actually happening in concert with everything that is alive, regardless of whether I'm actively in space or in touch with or in relationship with others. Even the ways that we imagine or conceive of support and accompaniment tend to be one individual's actions in relationship to another's.
Yes, I do believe that that's a construct, right, that we have. It's a construct because of the ways in which we are, especially within certain countries, right? So I think that in the country called America, that we have a hyper individualism. Right?
Mm.
This is part of how we've separated ourselves from the environment. We think of our successes and our freedoms and our rights, even, right? Our rights arise to us as individuals.
Hmm.
And this brings us into a way of being in which we have to even consciously work at being an accompaniment, right? Right? Rather than that being like a natural state of being. If we are to rise in our spiritual leadership, it would be a natural state of being to be in accompaniment with all
Hmm.
beings, right? Including the humans, and that it would be in relationship to the universe in a way that we would understand that our time here is brief in relationship to the universe. And so, therefore, right, how can we in this moment be as good a guest and a steward as we can? And then
Hmm.
what does that mean on a daily basis, right? What does that mean on a daily basis? And for this to be more of a natural state of being so that our minute decisions would be naturally managed. When you go into the grocery store, what are your behaviors as you just walk down the aisle? And what do you choose? How are you in relationship to the people who are also choosing? And are you aware that Auntie looks like she is making hard choices
Mm.
about what it is that she can and cannot buy? How can you be an accompaniment of that? And then what do you do about that? What do you do about that?
I'm really appreciating that you brought in the challenge of the worldview of individualism, the hyper-individualism, and especially because it relates to one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, well, just how worldview relates to and impacts even how we perceive and understand what our relationship to crisis is. So you're speaking to this much longer scale of time and how we situate ourselves inside of this much longer scale of time. And in the lead up to our conversation, I had been really reflecting on how in this like modern colonial context, we have this sense, especially Americans, we tend to be very short-sighted and very anti-historical. And I've noticed that Indigenous leaders, Indigenous communities that have a more intact or unbroken lineages, their own history, and unbroken contact with their own stories, tend to, and this could be a projection on my part, but it seems that there's like maybe just a little less reactivity or a little less freeze state in response to crisis conditions, like, or a different kind of grounding or a different way to meet crisis without panic.
Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about indigeneity and indigeneity as a way of being,
Hmm.
not in its cultural context. So certainly there are people who can call themselves indigenous today, as my people can, because of the historical cultural context of being native people in place who have a culture that has been brought forward from time immemorial and who have ways. And so there's that cultural historical context of indigeneity. And then there's a way of beingness
Hmm.
that culturally intact Indigenous people have. But it can be said that in a remarkable way, all Indigenous people throughout times would have had very, very similar ways, which means that it wasn't cultural.
Oh,
Okay.
interesting. I'm
Right.
following.
So, right. So the cultural part, I would have uniquely, right, to a Zulu or a Anishinaabe, right, or an Upiak, right?
Uh-huh.
The Kanaka Maoli version of our culture would be different. But in terms of ways, we would have certain ways that would be so foundational. They would be source. And that source would have been source for all folks of indigeneity, irrespective of where they are in the globe, wherever they were in time,
Hmm.
which means that all peoples at some point in their human history would have had that way of being. Okay?
Hmm.
If you cannot call yourself Indigenous today, it's because you were separated from that way so long ago.